Good evening. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU FM, Pacific Grove, California. It is August the 12th, 1983. This is tape number 614. There is always a lot of interest, continuous interest, in the assassination of John Kennedy, and I have so much material I could do one program a week for 2 or 3 years on that subject. So this evening, I'm going to do 1 hour on the Kennedy assassination and try to do more every week. As I said before, going back to the middle of this year, instead of waiting until the anniversary of Kennedy's death, I'm doing broadcasts every single week that involve people who were part of the Kennedy assassination. And if you take the broadcast or have the sheets that go with the broadcast, you'll see always the bibliography and sources of material goes to the Kennedy assassination. That's how I began my research in the first place. But there are always letters and orders for tapes specifically of the Kennedy murder. So this evening I'm going to do 1 hour on that and some material that may be of interest to you, an analysis of some important books on the Kennedy assassination, and also the way the government wrote about the researchers when they began to investigate them in 1976. Starting in 1963, President Lyndon Johnson was concerned right after the murder about the killing of Kennedy. But by 1976, the FBI and CIA had a full-scale attack ready for writers and researchers on the Kennedy assassination. Before we get into that, I just want to mention what we were talking about or sharing just a year ago this week. September 13th was the broadcast, number 562. That particular broadcast had to do with the Vatican connections to Permindex. Permindex was the Italian organization set up as the funding operation for the murder of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. The links of the Vatican to Permindex. Last year, there were those articles in Wall Street Journal, August 24th, 25th, and 26th, on the Nugan Bank, and extensive material on the Nugan Bank that I mentioned several weeks ago we have to update. The Vatican connections, the U.S. military, the Defense Department of this country to drug connections was taking place last year. Calvin Simmons, the black conductor, fell out of his canoe and died upstate New York, and I thought that was an outright murder, probably with a camera. These girls were standing on the shore, or women, I don't mean girls, taking pictures which we never saw. He was at a dinner party at Lake Placid where people from the State Department were there, a U.S. Foreign Service agent and his wife, and another person, a woman who was an ex-ambassador from somewhere, never identified. In the years since Calvin Simmons died, he was the black conductor from Oakland, probably the most brilliant musician, a black musician in the United States today, if not the world, for classical music. Now that he is dead, Oakland has replaced their symphony with a new conductor. He came from North Carolina, went to a Catholic school, specializes in Haydn and Wagner, German music, and Mr. Simmons never did make the New York Philharmonic or become part of that very white, Anglo-Saxon, snobbish symphony, string quartet, German music crowd. There's no way that a black conductor from Oakland was going to make it. And he didn't make it. It's been a year since he died, and he's been replaced with a perfect profile of the kind of person that the symphony societies would like to see in Oakland. I talked about the skin competitors and the brief mention of the car crash that Mary Martin was in, and Janet Gaynor, and Mary Martin's close friend, was killed in that crash, and how the driver was yelling Jews and was violently anti-Semitic. Mr. Cato was sentenced this past year, I believe, to 2 years in jail. He came from Denver, Colorado. The car was used by somebody, Mr. Mueller from Denver, Colorado, and I mentioned the competition of the face creams in the involvement of Mary Martin, who was currently at that time pushing for iMagnon, a cosmetic, and the possible competition between the world cosmetic market and the fact that a Jewish doctor was the one who had made this face cream that Mary Martin was selling. In this past year, her own son, Larry Hagman, has moved out of his house that he rents in Dallas with death threats. The man whose home he was renting, Mr. Kyle, K-Y-L-E, was killed in Bel Air, California, so that there's still a problem with those families, and the marketer of one of the face creams, Princess Marcella Borghese, Burgese, was a founder of a cosmetic company and also part of the Borghese family that were involved with Permindex and the murder of John Kennedy. If you don't have the broadcast, it may sound a little complicated to you, but we spent quite a bit of time last year on the Kennedy assassination and the Vatican and Permindex. I also had an outline a year ago with dates, important dates. If you don't have that broadcast, you can get those tapes. Quotations from the book The Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flammonde, and the outline of the way the Vatican became fascist and fell into the group that became the assassination teams. Very closely tied to the Vatican was this entire mafia, religious, a lot of industries, cars, Agnelli, the Fiats, the car people, the hotel people. There are a lot of multinational corporations closely linked to the Vatican, closely linked to those people that wanted John Kennedy murdered, and a good description of them and the people that are in the news today is in the book Kennedy Conspiracy by Paris Flammonde. I'm going to be discussing books on the Kennedy assassination, and I don't have Paris Flammonde's book down. I should as one of the very top books. It's hard when you have to decide, limit 6 or 7 books on a particular subject that you think are the most important, and just because of space, Flammonde's book is not on that list, but it really should be, and I should update that list because of the links to Permindex. He's the only writer that really gets into the subject of Permindex, and it's in the news today with so much on the Vatican and Licio Gelli and Klaus Barbie's links to the Vatican, and that was just a year ago this week. Now, the Philippine government has set up a Warren Commission to investigate the murder, the political murder of Mr. Aquino down there, and I'm going to do one broadcast maybe next week or the week after on the comparisons to the murder in Manila of Benigno, Benigno, Aquino. Most of you can spell it right now. He's getting a lot of attention in the news. I'll compare it to the Kennedy assassination on the kinds of people that were murdered and also the way it is covered up in the national headlines to get so much attention. Now, incidentally, the Philippine government has been noted to have spies in this country that can kill or blackmail people who do not like Mr. Marcos in the Philippines. And the U.S. intelligence agencies have reported that there are military teams here in the Philippines that single out certain persons to harass who don't like the government over there. With the time of the Tylenol scandals, I went into various deaths that appeared to be suicide or coincidental cyanide deaths. And one was in Philadelphia, a student at the university there. And John Judge was the person who did research on that case and found out that he was a Philippine dissident who was against Marcos in the Philippines, who died of what was supposed to be a cyanide, suicide or something, cyanide in his medicine cabinet that he took. And he was a dissident from the far-off Philippines working right in the United States. Cyanide is still a very good Nazi tool of silence. Now, this past week, you've been reading a lot about Martin Luther King and the marches, and I have a dream speech and the rallies, and the summary of those meetings, in essence, the most important thing for me was the lack of a leader. The San Francisco Examiner, August 25th, has an article, "The Movement Needs a Leader and Badly." And the role of the FBI, according to their own memos, they wrote them, I didn't, is that we have to replace Martin Luther King, that they would select a leader because they're the leader that was by charisma or circumstance or history selected, a Gandhi or a Kennedy or a Martin Luther King. These kind of people don't come around very often, so you can split it with a lot of people that come up from behind the next elections. It could be Eugene McCarthy, and George McGovern wants to run, and Mr. Anderson wants to run, and Jesse Jackson, and you split it with a whole bunch of nerds. They're nothing but a bunch of individuals that can't do anything for society, collectively or otherwise, who don't have the charisma to get off the ground. That's why they're alive. And they are not the kinds of people like Robert Kennedy or Martin Luther King or John Kennedy or Gandhi or Aquino who can write speeches and mean what they say and die for what they mean. We're talking about the real need for leaders. Marlon Brando was on television at the time of the meetings last week or the week before for Martin Luther King, and his opinion was the tragedy was not having leadership, that he'd been in the early marches, he'd been in Washington in April when Dr. King was there, and 6 or 7 days later Dr. King was murdered, and he was saying not only the sense of loss of the person, but there are no leaders around to help solve the problems for which these leaders emerged. That when they die, it seems that they just simply can't pass on the ideas to the people around them, and it is a real tragedy. Now, a while back, I don't know how long ago, maybe a year ago, I was asked to do an article for We or Playgirl, one of the magazines. It wasn't Playgirl, it was We or Penthouse, on the most important books on John Kennedy. I think it was for the anniversary of Kennedy's death last year. And I was paid for, the proposal was given to me, I was paid to do the story, and then the magazine folded up. I think it was We that was consumed by Penthouse and went out, or they changed hands, and it was never printed. But I did a lot of work on it, spent several months on it, and it's very pertinent now. And I thought I would share that material with you the way I saw it then, because just a year ago wouldn't be much different than the way I perceive books now, except I would add Paris Flamon's name to this list. They didn't want me to have a long list of books on the assassination. In fact, I stretched it further than they asked me. They wanted 6 to 7 books, the most important books on the murder of John Kennedy. If you were just starting out, or you wanted to give your children or family a gift, or schools a gift, what 7 books would you have that describe the murder of John Kennedy? And I went to 8. And 9 would be Flamon, but that wasn't what they wanted. But on my own, I can say that many, and I'll tell you what they were, in the order that I had them and the way I see it, as I say, perceive it today. Number 1, Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, written by Joachim Josten, Joachim Joesten, published in New York by Marzani and Munsell in 1964. The second book was Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane. And I'll give you the reasons why I selected these books, but I'm telling you what they were now. The Rush to Judgment. I don't like Lane, but it was a good book, and it opened up a lot, and for that we can be grateful. I sneaked in 4 books as one, Forgive My Grief, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4 by Penn Jones, Jr. That was considered as one book, published 1965, 1967, 1969, and 1974, Penn Jones in Midlothian, Texas. The 4th was a document addendum to the Warren Report, published by David Lifton, who came out last year, the year before last, with Best Evidence, which was not a good book. Document addendum is the actual meetings of the Warren Commission members, and you just can't beat that for script. That's Citext Publication, Sighttext Publications, California, 1968. It's out of print, but David gave permission for Tom Davis at Research or me to copy that book, and we really should be getting those out to you. Farewell America by James Hepburn. That was a pseudonym. It was a accumulation of people in the intelligence community living in Paris who were investigating the attempted murders of Charles de Gaulle. Many of you saw, there's been the fictionalized story of the assassination of de Gaulle, and you may have seen the movies on that. There's been several movies on it, The Day of the Jackal and other takeoffs on that event. The people investigating the assassination attempts on de Gaulle came into the organizations and the companies and corporations that were behind the murder of John Kennedy and intelligence agencies. So it's a compilation of authors from the intelligence community, and it was put out in Canada. Who's Who in the CIA by Julius Mader, M-A-D-E-R, from Germany in 1968. The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal, with the pseudonym William Torbett, privately published in Dallas in 1970, available in reprint in Aptos, California. That you can get that now. And then the last book I had down was The Assassination of JFK by Coincidence or Conspiracy, Bernard Fensterwald, Jr., Zebra Books, 1977, New York. it would be a toss-up between Paris Lamont, but he has pictures of people, very important mobsters, and again, I don't like Fensterwald, and he's part of the CIA, but the book is valuable for a lot of the cast of characters. It's very important to know the cast of characters. Now, 20 years have passed since the murder of John Kennedy. At the present time, there are over 250 books alone about the circumstances of his death, or the four murders. There were four murders there. The murder of President Kennedy, and then Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit a little while later at noon, then the lone suspect Lee Harvey Oswald, and then Oswald's assailant Jack Ruby. So there are actually four deaths to cover and I don't think of it as just the Kennedy death. So in selecting a book, again, it had to go back to which books are important when you think of four deaths, not just the president. Now, the government's conclusions were published in a single volume, and there's a lot of confusion for new students or new listeners, and a whole new generation is growing up with this. It is called the Warren Report, and that's over 500 pages. And this was what the Warren Commission, a select team put together by Lyndon Johnson, concluded, that Lee Harvey Oswald acted as the lone assassin and there was no conspiracy. Then, in order to support that conclusion, they published 26 volumes of witness testimony and exhibits, 16 volumes of witnesses that were interrogated, and the remaining of the 26 was for the exhibits upon which the testimony was based. So those 26 volumes were made available from the government printing office in 1964. They printed only 800 copies. They had a cutoff, obviously, because by the time people would catch on, there'd be too many people reading it, and you can get it at libraries, you can't take it home. So that Warren conclusion that Oswald did alone was based on 26 volumes. And the testimony and the exhibits, those 26 volumes, did not support the conclusion of the Warren Report. So private investigators and writers and researchers had a field day, and this caused a whole generation of people who would prove and delve into these various conspiracies. If Kennedy's assassination had one purpose, it may have been to open up the field of muckraking and exposing, because from the time of World War I up through and to Kennedy's death, so many, many crimes and murders were done and covered up. But this might have been the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, from all this information, from these over 250 books, you have to have some starting point, and I put the books that I listed and read to you in some chronological order also. The first one by Yosten, that was the very first book to come out. It paved the way for every other book to follow. Now, he was a well-known writer. He lived in Nazi Germany. He was forced to flee. He went to Sweden. He was kicked out of Sweden and sent to Denmark. The Nazis came to Denmark, and then he left, went back to Sweden, got married, and took a trip to various countries and landed in the United States. After the war, he went back to Germany, and as soon as Kennedy was murdered, he flew right out to Dallas, Texas, because he realized the similarities between the murder of John Kennedy and the murder of first hundreds and then millions in Nazi Germany. So Justin published in Europe exposés, nonfiction exposés of European scandals. He is the expert, more dedicated, say, than Jack Anderson and some of the other people. There aren't many like him, even Anderson. But he was an expert on it, and as he survived the Nazi era, he knew all the deceptions and the murders of politicians, and he recognized, as I say, the similarities between the president's death and the others that he already documented. So his book claimed that Lee Harvey Oswald was completely innocent of shooting John Kennedy. He didn't say he was totally innocent. He said he had to be working for the United States government, such as the CIA and FBI, but in the end, he was a decoy and he was expendable, just as the fellow that shot Aquino out at the airport in the Philippines. He's a decoy. They don't brag about how well trained he was as a marksman or in the military or whatever. They didn't even identify his name, let him out at the airfield rotting in the sun. But Oswald could be a decoy and could be shot down then and taken in while the other people leave town. So Assassin or Fall Guy was the first comparison of a historical event, fascism in Germany with fascism in the United States. And the important thing about this book is that there had been studies of the Lincoln assassination that were really relegated to being a hobby, and people recreate the battlefields and the Civil War and so forth. But the United States had this 1,000-day president who was gunned down, and the suspicions were rampant that the conspiracy existed. So he went back to Germany, the home of all this. It was interesting because Rudolf Winiger, a German, is in charge of writing the Warren Report later. He goes back to Germany, and based upon a legitimate fear of fascism that it would rise up again in the United States, he wrote his book. Now remember, in 1976, the FBI, according to my FBI document papers, and I can read those to you if you want and share those I have before, began papers on me because I was afraid of fascism in this country. So that was a major contribution of Jostin to the element of research, the comparisons, and the state of mind and the expertise he had. There wasn't anything sensational about him. There were similarities he saw, and he was the first one to jump in there and take the situation and analyze it. Now, the next book, Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, is about the grassy knoll. I make fun of it because Mark and a lot of other researchers I could give you and will in the broadcast on Kennedy, the names of 10 or 12 researchers who are still cutting grass at the grassy knoll, like Bob Cutler. Some of them are counting blades of grass. In fact, I have a joke that this is the joke. One man says to another, why haven't they solved the Kennedy assassination yet? There's so many researchers. And then the answer is, well, they're still counting the testicles on Officer Tippit. The research relegates itself down to some very fundamental counting and adding, and people are still on that grassy knoll. But that doesn't matter. The grassy knoll is where the shooting took place. And Mark Lane wrote Rush to Judgment. He was known in the American public. He'd been a New York assemblyman. He traveled around the United States. He gave lectures on the Kennedy conspiracy. I heard him at Beverly Hills High School arguing with Melvin Belli and the Civil Liberties Union, who compared him to Adolf Hitler, questioning the Warren Commission, the Civil Liberties Union, Mr. Wirin, W-I-R-I-N, who was right with Saran as soon as Saran was arrested for shooting Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel. A few years later, there was a panel, and they all took on Mark Lane, these righteous people, and the Civil Liberties attorney compared him for whatever reason I can't imagine, but I kept the notes going way back to those days. So long before many other people got into this, Mark Lane was traveling around the country, getting people interested in the fact that there was a conspiracy, and he took this small section and made it famous as the grassy knoll. He traveled everywhere, and it's a name that rings a lot of bells to people and will throughout history, just as the Ford Theater and the Abraham Lincoln event. His book dealt primarily with questions regarding the assassination weapons, the witness testimony that was never used by the government, but most important of all were 50 pages of footnotes in which he cited volume and page number from the Warren Commission hearings or the Warren Report. The hearings came out in 1964, Rush to Judgment came in 1966, and book reviewers were putting him down, and the book was put down. The answer is that future writers and students could look for themselves, and it's very important to have indexing. So Jostin took the conspiracy and the comparisons of a fall guy and the way they worked in Nazi Germany and opened this up to us. And Mark Lane took us directly to the grassy knoll and questioned the guns, the Italian Carcano, which came from Rome. And now I realize, reading more and more about that, it goes back to Permindex in Rome, that a particular Italian Carcano that was used to frame him, because the first gun was the German Mauser. And he goes at length into all the witnesses there, and it's a very valuable book. The next book that is important is the series by Penn Jones on Forgive My Grief. They're important, as I say, because in those books, he turns us on to the people who were murdered, the immediate witnesses to the Kennedy assassination, to the Officer Tippit shooting, to the events in Dallas and afterwards. In his series of books, Penn still has a newsletter, The Continuing Inquiry, and I wish he would keep the Continuing Inquiry just active with the particular people who were killed yesterday or the day before. There's a lot of news going on, but primary witnesses today are being killed, and what he did was to open this up to the world. Now, Penn Jones Jr. was a former publisher, owner of a newspaper, the Midlothian Mirror, and now he gets out his newsletter, The Continuing Inquiry. You can all subscribe. If you want, I can give you the address. He was the first researcher and writer to turn on people to the fact of the continuous murder of witnesses from untimely and unusual deaths. Now, many books were being started to challenge the lone assassin, but Penn had 4 books, 1965, 67, 1969, and 1974, going on about the people that were dying as the inquiries were going on. And this is a definite pattern. In fact, Penn will have to update in his newsletter the people that have had mental breakdowns while they were doing investigations or afterwards. A fellow called me last week from Toronto, and he was telling me how Sylvia Marr had gone into a mental institution while she was helping Cyril Wecht with his testimony before the House Select Committee, that she was in 3 weeks. And Richard Popkin, Popkin, who wrote The Second Oswald, had a mental breakdown. And Ted Gandolfo had Mark Lane and Dick Gregory over one afternoon in New York, and he called me. He was on the phone, and they were there. And the next day, he was a basket case with Thorazine and prolaxine and never could really do research. And there's a whole list of people that were put in mental institutions. I have many more, and besides those being killed. We'll have to update the researchers or members of their family, I can speak for that, who got this LSD and medical substances that alter personality. But Penn Jones began right away. He was a Democrat. He was a registered Democrat. He lived in Texas near the Dallas-Fort Worth area. He ran up to the scene of the assassination, and like Yostin, he was Johnny on the spot. He was right there. Mark Lane had flown out right away, too, at the time. So there's absolutely no way to ever understand the conspiracies and how they hold together so long. This is 20 years, unless you know who was murdered, who might have given information on what was going on before their murder. It's like Vicki Morgan. If she wants to talk about the cabinet or the senators or the president of the United States, she gets a baseball bat on her head, and then there's a lot of dirty tricks and crimes and illegalities that she knew about that could even go into Johnny Carson, friends of Alfred Bloomingdale and the de Cordovas, and she, with the DeLorean investigation, maybe it was the time then to crack her head open. The important thing about Penn's books was to understand the way people died, going out a window, throats cut, hung in a jail, and study the way they died, the homicides that appeared to be homicides. For example, when Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the book depository, a very good witness said he saw him in back of the building and Sheriff Craig saw him leave the front of the building. Well, the witness who saw him leave the back, that was the story that held for the Warren Commission, because he was supposed to then get into a cab and into a bus and then to a cab. Well, the Sheriff Craig, who saw him leave from the front, was killed, harassed, and killed. The bus driver was killed. The cab driver was killed. The rooming house lady was killed. Mrs. Roberts, who heard a police car honk, and Oswald in the rooming house come out shortly after. So the work of Penn Jones is monumental in describing the homicides, and as I said, his last book came out in 1974. We should all try to get a list together and update that or put that in the newsletter. Now, the document addendum is something else. There was one book on the Patsies and the comparison to fascism, Yostin's book, The Grassy Knoll by Lane, The Murder of Witnesses by Penn Jones. And the document addendum is the Warren Commission themselves, out of their little sweet mouths. David Lifton went to Washington and went to the National Archives and got minutes of the Warren Commission members. December 5th, 1963, they started. He had 11 meetings transcribed or printed in this book through September 18th, 1964. And if you read the Warren Commission members, they sealed for all time their criminality, their ignorance, the mechanics of the commission. Their lone assassin, lone conspiracy was hogwash. And one of those members went on to become president of the United States. Richard Nixon put Gerald Ford on the Warren Commission representing Republican interests. And when Nixon came out because of the Watergate scandals, Gerald Ford gave the amnesty to Nixon for his crimes, which included a role in the murder of Kennedy with the anti-Castro Cubans. And then Gerald Ford becomes president of the United States. When you hear these commission members discuss criminal matters among each other, you get a view of their falsehoods and lies. This is probably one of the finest books preserved for the history books because it's them speaking. It isn't anybody interpreting. You can't smear the authors. You can't do anything. That is the gang. Alan Dulles of the CIA and John J. McCloy and Leon Jaworski and Gerald Ford. We'll take a 1-minute break and continue more on these books and government papers about the researchers that I think is very basic to what was happening right after Kennedy was killed. This is Mae Brussell, KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California. It is side 2 of broadcast number 614, September the 12th, 1983. I'm going into some information on the Kennedy assassination and important basic books a person should really investigate and read if they want to understand the trauma and the deceptions that took place 20 years ago with the murder of John Kennedy, and then you can add to that thousands of murders, because if you study this one case well, all the others and the cover stories and their diaries and the lies and the special commissions all seem to fall into this format. The great coup was the United States coup in 1963, carefully planned by the intelligence community and then applied to all the other murders. Now, the next book that was important on the list that I included was a book, Farewell America. I mentioned that to you, written by James Hepburn. That's the cover name for a group of people from the intelligence community. It was the first detailed book extensively to deal with organizations and individuals who wanted John Kennedy murdered, and the oil and the steel and the corporations. It took the murder away from certain evidence in the Dealey Plaza area to the international corporations. And we wonder, well, how did Permindex in Italy, that we were talking about a year ago tonight, be involved with the murder of John Kennedy? This goes into the international work. It is the compilation, as I said, of intelligence agents in Europe. Their inquiry led them to the murder of John Kennedy, and it is a documented book on how and why political assassinations take place. Basically, there is a market or a job interest or an investment in countries or investment in cocaine or heroin and the opium poppy, the mob money, the traffic of mob money. And a Democrat will kill a Democrat, or a Republican will kill a Republican, or an FBI agent will kill an FBI agent, whether it's J. Edgar Hoover or William Sullivan, to keep the lid, whether it's the profits from drug traffic or multinational corporate profits. The game is really profits of corporate level, banking level, and narcotics. And those people that get in the way of this bloody pattern are off. It doesn't matter who they are. Now, there's a lot of passion behind this book, Farewell America. They were dedicated to this. They wrote in 1968 that if the youth and young people of America didn't read this and didn't take it seriously, they'd be in deep trouble. Well, the youth and the people didn't take it seriously, and they are in deep trouble. But along with the facts and the names and the dates of the international corporations, they have the motive based on dollars and profits, as I said, and that is their big concern. There's a fear that freedom in America will decline and it will be sold out for money, and their fear is, in fact, coming true. The next book on the list that I mentioned is Who's Who in the CIA, and this took the assassination research level into a different place, into agents such as like the Klaus Barbie, but he isn't in the book, he's just too obvious. The agents of the Eastern Europe, of the Russians, the Germans, the Hungarians, the anti-communists, and the Americans and American politicians, whether it's Eugene McCarthy, the American politicians are in the Who's Who in the CIA, a whole bunch of them. But this Mr. Mader, who wrote the book, has a very good account of people born in different countries. He has their birth dates, France, Germany, preponderance of Germans who began to work for the CIA. And when the document addendum came out, it identified a man in the Pentagon. When Earl Warren and the commission was asking as early as December or January who would write the Warren report, the minutes of the meeting said Dr. Rudolph August Winnacker, W-I-N-N-A-C-K-E-R, would write the Warren report. When you look up in the Who's Who in the CIA, there is Mr. Winnacker with an autobiographical or biographical sketch, born in Germany, and from 1949 to 1965 was chief of the historical division of the Pentagon, probably brought here by Fritz Kramer and Henry Kissinger, right out of Oberammergau or who knows where. Nobody's ever done any research. I've talked about this guy for I don't know how many years since the document addendum came out and Who's Who in the CIA, but nobody has bothered to follow this through to any extent. The important thing is that it mentions two agents in the Soviet Union, Mr. McVicker and Mr. Snyder, that worked with Marina Oswald and Lee Oswald in the embassy in Soviet Union, and it mentions people in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that worked with Lee and Marina Oswald in the Central Intelligence Agency there. So it was written in Germany, but it identifies the American embassy in the Soviet Union and the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And most of the key people that I had already identified as being agents with Lee and Marina Oswald, because from 1964, September 64, up through this time period of 68, I was cross-filing all that stuff from the Warren Commission hearings. It's not indexed. The hearings and the exhibit are not indexed. Rewriting it as a spy novel on how people met, the safe houses, where they got their money, and how their business transacted. And all the characters that I put as part of this great spy story were identified in the book Who's Who in the CIA, coming out of both David Lifton's minutes of his meetings and out of Germany. It was published in Germany. Now, the Torbett document I've spoken about many times, and a good portion of the listeners who subscribe regularly to the tapes have this. Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal. It was written by an attorney in Texas. It was given to me from Penn Jones, and this attorney and Bill Boxley helped. Bill Boxley was in the CIA. I met him in New Orleans when I went to help Jim Garrison there, or thought I could help him. Boxley has passed away. He helped with this. This, again, like Farewell America, was written from the gut level of Texas, of people that knew Lyndon Johnson, knew the CIA, knew organized crime, knew Permindex. The Nomenclature of an Assassination Cabal is not a book for anyone who believes in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny. It's a story of real communities and real people, and the daring can read it. It is about the killing of the president and the networks involving people like Roy Cohn, who's now with Western Goals and the Los Angeles Police Department, sharing those files, and with Larry McDonald with Western Goals and Roy Cohn. He's in there through his corporation, and General Dynamics, the chief of security of General Dynamics, was a close friend of Lee and Marina Oswald's in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. The Clarks were. Gally Clark was a Russian czarist from the Sherbatov family, Sherbatov. That's similar to the Rockefellers in this country. The links of the Defense Department, the contracts with the Defense Department, of the mob, the organized crime relationship to the Defense Department. This book is about white Russian czarists that came over to this country and started to work with the FBI and the CIA to make war and avenge the Soviet Union and get their country back. It's about the organized crime syndicate connections of Jack Ruby and the Mafia. It's about Division 5 of the FBI with William Sullivan, who was murdered just at the time of the House Select Committee investigations. It's about the Defense Department, how the Defense Department gets contracts to guard their missile bases. And it's about NASA and the German scientists brought here after World War II. It's a very good book. Research mostly done in France, published in Canada. All of these books, incidentally, are available. Now, the last book that I put on the list, but I do want to put in this list of books to read, the Paris Limon book, but at the time I couldn't put it on the list, is The Assassination of JFK, the one by Bernard Fensterwald, Coincidence or Conspiracy. Now, this isn't a multinational nomenclature, the Torbett document. It also goes by the name of the Torbett document, William Torbett. That's the assumed name. The Torbett document and Farewell America are international in their business and their motives, and they name names. But Fensterwald gets into the crime syndicate, and it's a very important book because it has a biographical section on persons involved in some way with the Kennedy assassination, or the investigation, or the cover-up, and it's got their pictures. It's nice to see people, see their faces, and to document this kind of work, and that's why I think it's a very valuable book. And some of the people described and photographed were members of the original Warren Commission and their legal staff that he has in this book. Some are from the CIA, the FBI, the Defense Department. Many are from organized crime. Robert Mayu worked with both the FBI and CIA, the Howard Hughes organization, the Mafia. He worked with Sam Giancana and John Rosselli and the Mafia hit teams. It's a bedside book. You can read little chapters at a time. You can refer to it when you're reading. Penn Jones, the victims, many listed in Forget My Grief, are described in detail, telling why they had to be killed. So that all of these books that I've mentioned to you have not they don't stand alone. They interrelate to each other, which they should do, so that Penn's material on the victims are also in Fensterwald's books. Fensterwald's an attorney for the CIA. He's now representing Mary Ann Paisley. He represented James McCord at the time of the Senate hearings, the Watergate hearings. He's had a long association with CIA, with Carlos Marcello, the crime figures, and congressional investigations. But that doesn't mean it's a bad book. It's like I said about New Solidarity. Some of their conclusions are rotten, but some of the figures and dates where people met and who they knew are important. So that the personalities have nothing to do with the value of the books that I selected. I'm not prejudiced in that way to leave a name out because I don't like or trust that particular person. The facts are that these books are very valuable and they're available, and I've selected them as important for the reasons that I said to you. Oswald, Assassin, or Fall Guy brings out the use of decoys, the way you create patsies, the way you murder them to make the conspiracy hold, and also the intense knowledge of the similarities to fascist Europe that Josten brought with him. Rush to Judgment is on the mechanics of killing. The weapon or the weapons, the directions, the ballistics, the location of the people who shot as against the conclusion of the single person in the sixth-story window, the direct witnesses on the scene of the crime that are not used, and it's a very important book because it is the scene of the crime. Forgive My Grief enlarges how people are shot. It takes away from the lone assassin conclusion. Penn Jones goes away from the argument about that, but simply details how many people are killed, in what way they're killed, in order that that lone assassin conclusion is still dangling after 20 years. And the document addendum exposes forever their own words and the way they work for Well America, opens the door to the motives. I always am asked, well, who would want Kennedy killed? Who would think about it? And you go into the problems with the steel, with sending General Walker into a mental hospital and starting the civil rights movement, giving the blacks education and the nuclear test ban treaty, or the intent to pull back from Vietnam, which would hurt the mafia because that's where we got our tentacles in the drug trade, or the rapprochement with Khrushchev and getting along with him, and Pope John the 23rd, the three of them were very close and wanted peace, or pulling back from the Bay of Pigs. That was just the final coup de grace. That was it for poor old Kennedy, pulling back at that time. Who's Who in the CIA shows the use of the Germans in the intelligence community. It shows the people that were, in fact, working with Lee and Marina Oswald in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in the Soviet Union. And Fensterwald's book goes into the crime syndicate, which is the part that makes the Nazi or the Vatican connections or the conspirators or the Permindex work. The mafia, the growing of the opium, the poppy, is very lucrative, in case you haven't heard that one yet. And that is what keeps the armbands and the swastikas and the death squads and the paramilitary going. And in conclusion, the Paris-Lamone's Kennedy conspiracy does go into the area of, similar to the Torbett document, of the Italian connections, the worldwide connections. It's a very, very good book, and I really should put it on the list once and for all and say that there are 9 or 10 really good books. If you want to study who killed the President of the United States, you can read all 9 of those books. And if you read all 9 of those books, then you'll know who's shooting Mr. Aquino or killing anybody else, because it's all there, and after a few years have passed, like 20 years, it'd be easier for you to read these 9 books and compare them to what's happening now and realize that many of us were just in divergent territory. We were doing our own work. Nobody was doing it for us. There were private investigators. There were 8 or 9 in the country, and I was one of them, who just sat down and wanted to know why the government was lying and find out the way they lie. Now, in the conclusion of this broadcast, for 15 minutes or so, I want to read to you, and I don't believe I've ever had this on the program. This is from the CIA documents from Freedom of Information Act that were released September 1976. This is document number 1035-960. If you want to send for it, to the United States government, CIA document regarding their plan of attack on the Warren Commission critics. And this is the way it begins. It has a lot of parts. I'll read it fast. I don't usually read verbatim, but I can't transcribe or paraphrase the way the government writes, because their mindset is so interesting that you really should hear what they have to say. Number one, under psychology, our concern. From the day of President Kennedy's assassination on, there has been speculation about the responsibility for his murder. Although this was stemmed for a time by the Warren Commission report, which appeared at the end of September, various writers have now come and tried to scan the Commission's published report and documents for new pretexts for questioning, and there's been a new wave of books and articles. They said, having stemmed the tide, there are new people trying to scan the published reports and criticizing the Commission findings. In most cases, the critics have speculated as to the existence of some kind of a conspiracy, and often they imply that the Commission itself was involved, not John McCloy or, oh my goodness, Gerald Ford. No, I shouldn't. Okay, let's get back to what they say. Presumably, as a result of the increasing challenge to the Warren Commission's report, a public opinion poll recently indicated that 46% of the American people did not think that Oswald acted alone. This is 1976. And more than half of these thought the Commission left some questions unresolved. Doubtless polls abroad would show similar or more adverse results. Abroad, they were smarter and faster than us. Now, point two. This trend of opinion is a matter of concern to the U.S. government, including our organization, the CIA. The members of the Warren Commission were naturally chosen for their integrity, their experience, and prominence. John McCloy, okay. They represented both the major parties, and they and their staff were deliberately drawn from all sections of the country. Just because of the standing of the Commission, efforts to impugn their rectitude and wisdom tend to cast doubt on the whole leadership of American society. Can you imagine if you questioned Leon Jaworski, Gerald Ford? I'm not talking about Richard Russell from Georgia, or Hale Boggs from Louisiana, or Mr. Cooper, a crony of Lyndon Johnson's from Kentucky. I'm just talking about the ones that are alive and kicking ass right now and doing a lot of trouble. It says their standing of the Commission would impugn the rectitude and wisdom and tend to cast doubt on the whole leadership of American society. Everybody has to be bad if you don't like the Warren Commission. Moreover, there seems to be an increasing tendency to hint that President Johnson himself, as the one person who might be said to have benefited, was some way responsible for the assassination. Innuendo of such seriousness affects not only the individual concerned, that's LBJ, but also the whole reputation of the American government. You see, the CIA thinks if you question Lyndon Johnson, you question the whole government, 200 million people, if you don't like LBJ. It goes on. Our organization itself is directly involved. This is the CIA. Among other facts, we contributed information to the investigation. Conspiracy theories have frequently thrown suspicion on our CIA, for example, by falsely alleging that Oswald worked for us, Lee Harvey Oswald. The aim of this dispatch is to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims. The aim of this dispatch, this is the CIA memo under psychology, September 76, is to discount, discredit, and counter claims of the conspiracy theorists so as to inhibit the circulation of such claims in other countries. We've got to stop them. Background information is supplied in a classified selection on a number of unclassified actions. Point 3, attachments rather. Point 3, actions. We do not recommend the discussion of the assassination questions be initiated where it is not already taking place. But where the discussion is active, however, the addresses are requested to discuss the publicity with these people and friendly elite contacts. We will have a liaison with friendly elite contacts, politicians and editorial writers of the newspapers, CIA, and point to them that the Warren Commission was as thorough an investigation as humanly possible and that the charges of these people have no serious foundation and that further speculation discussion only plays into the hands of the opposition. Now you become you're helping the communists if you question the Warren report. Point out also that parts of the conspiracy talk appear to be deliberately generated by communist propagandists. This is what they tried in Philippines, Marcos, to say the communists were behind the shooting of Aquino. Okay. urge them, these newspaper people and politicians, to use their influence to discourage unfounded and irresponsible speculation. Another point under this, to employ propaganda assets, this is the newspaper media, to answer and refute the attacks of the critics. Use book reviews and feature articles. Those are particularly appropriate for this purpose. The unclassified attachment to the guidance should provide useful background material to our assets, our ACI, that's their CIA agents. Our play should point out, they use the word play, our play should point out as applicable that the critics are, one, wedded to theories adopted before the evidence was in, that two, they're politically interested, three, they're financially interested, you have to make a gain or profit off of it, four, that they are hasty and inaccurate in their research, or five, they're infatuated with their own theories. If you question the Warren Report, you're infatuated with your own theories, and the CIA was to use book reviews and articles to point this out. In the course of discussion of the whole phenomena of criticism, a useful strategy be to single out Epstein's theory for attack, that was Edward Epstein, using the attached Fletcher-Nebel article and Spectator piece for background. Fletcher-Nebel wrote 7 Days in May. Although Mark Lane's book is much less convincing than Epstein's and comes off badly where contested by knowledgeable critics, it is also more difficult to answer as a whole, as one becomes lost in a morass of unrelated details. This is so brilliant. I think next week or each week I should continue with this. I'll do more on this right now, but imagine the logic of this. Use Edward Epstein's book to attack, because Mark Lane is less convincing and he seems more knowledgeable, and it'd be too difficult. They can't understand what he's saying, and they can't answer it as a whole. You get lost in unrelated details. Every point of rush to judgment had a related detail, whether you like Lane or not. Point 4. In private or in media discussions not directed at any particular writer or in attacking publications which may be forthcoming, the following arguments should be useful. Now, this is for the CIA to use in forthcoming discussions where you don't want to get one person, and you're going to attack the publications. They have a list of things that you should use and ways you should argue. They have 6 points on what you should do. A, this is what you say about these books. 1, no new evidence has emerged which the commission didn't consider. You know, it would be interesting to go back over the old book reviews, and I've saved all these articles in chronological order, and just check off the obedient writers who later were linked through the Senator Church Committee to the CIA. There were 400 writers, but they didn't identify all of them. But getting back to this point, in private or in media discussion with writers not directed at any in particular, these are the suggestions. I want to repeat that. A, no significant evidence has emerged which the commission didn't consider. I'm sure you've read that before, and you read book reviews that are negative now. The assassination is sometimes compared, for example, by Joachim Josten, the one I mentioned before, the Oswald from Fall guy, and Bertrand Russell, with the Dreyfus case in France. That's where a Jewish person was charged with conspiracy against the army and went to Devil's Island and then later was cleared. However, unlike that case, the attack on the Warren Commission, it produced no new evidence, no new culprits. They've been convincingly identified, none of them been identified, and there's no agreement among the critics. A better parallel, though an imperfect one, might be with the Reichstag fire of Germany of 1933, of which some competent historians like Mr. Tobias or Taylor believe the fire was set by Van, V-A-N, small D-E-R, L, capital L-U-B-B-E, on his own initiative without acting for Nazis or communists. The Nazis tried to pin the blame on the communists, but the latter have been much more successful in telling the world that the Nazis were to blame. So it says ignore some of the evidence and transfer it over to some of these situations where there are no agreements. One says it's Nazis, one says it's communists, one it's on its own, and leave it open. Point B, critics usually overvalue particular items and ignore others. They tend to put more emphasis on recollection of individual eyewitnesses to the event, which are less reliable and more divergent, and more handholds for criticism, and less on the ballistic, autopsy, and photographic evidence. A close examination of the Commission's records will show that conflicting eyewitness accounts are quoted out of context and were discarded by the Commission for good and sufficient reasons. Well, in time, that argument didn't hold up because the real serious work was into the ballistic, into the autopsy, into the photographic evidence, and it was because those things were so far off that the witness testimony became important because of the discrepancies in the autopsy, in the ownership of the rifle, in whether the rifle could shoot, whether Oswald even had shells, where it was located, whether he brought in the building, and trying to check out the physical evidence, whether he went down the stairs or was in the dining room having his Coca-Cola. All of the discrepancies in the physical evidence with no palm prints on the rifle and no fingerprints then caused researchers to go to the witnesses because the physical evidence was off the wall. But they've got this all turned around. Point C. Conspiracy on the large scale, often suggested, would be impossible to conceal in the United States, especially since informants could expect to receive large royalties. Note that Robert Kennedy, Attorney General at the time, and John Kennedy's brother would be the last man to overlook or conceal any conspiracy, which is a lie because he was blackmailed with his photographic tapes and with Marilyn Monroe and all the various women. And long before he was the official Attorney General, they had him compromised along the way, but particularly in that office. It's a note Robert Kennedy, with his role, would be the last to overlook it. And as one reviewer pointed out, Congressman Gerald Ford would hardly have held his tongue for the sake of the Democratic administration. Gerald Ford would hardly hold his tongue. Hasn't it been proven that he held his tongue when he became President of the United States and hushed up about Richard Nixon's crimes? Then it said Senator Russell would have every political interest to expose the misdeeds on the part of Chief Justice Earl Warren. Senator Russell was the man who said, I don't ask what I can do for my country, but what my country can do for Georgia. And out of Atlanta, Georgia, and DeKalb County and Mitchell were Bell and the home country of Larry McDonald and the various assassination teams, the Network of Murder Incorporated, Georgia has been a large stronghold of Lockheed, of military bases, of counterintelligence. Russell would be the last person to blow open all these people. The crime syndicate, the mafia in Georgia, the military, the CIA, and he was the watchdog in Congress for the CIA, so of course he would shut up. Then their logic goes on. A conspirator, moreover, would hardly choose a location for shooting where so much depended on conditions beyond his control. The route, the speed of cars, the moving target, the risk of the assassin would be discovered. A group of wealthy conspirators could have arranged a much more secure conditions. No, it worked better to have Kennedy shot right in the open and everyone flies away and leaves town, and William Seymour and Lauren Hall, Eugene Brading, none of those people were ever taken seriously. The people involved have been identified. The locations of the shots have been identified. The logic of the CIA in covering this up is totally off the wall. Point D, critics have often been enticed by a form of intellectual pride. They light on some theory and they fall in love with it. Do you think that's different than what the CIA agent does who writes his paper? Doesn't he have some kind of a pride that he falls in love with? It's that they scoff at the commission because it did not answer every question with a flat decision. Actually, the makeup of the commission and its staff was an excellent safeguard against government overcommitment to any one theory or against the illegal transformation of probability into certainties. And of course, the commission was filled with probabilities. The next point, D, Oswald would not have been any sensible person's choice for a conspirator. He was a loner. He was mixed up, of questionable reliability, an unknown quantity to any professional intelligence service. He was at Subic Base in the Philippines, at Sugi in Japan, working with the U-2. His officer said he memorized the Marine manuals and all the defense for the United States. He was with Mr. McVicker of the CIA and Mr. Snyder at the embassy, the Soviet embassy in the CIA, and Priscilla Johnson. He had memorized the Russian language when he brought this woman Minsk from the radio factory where he met Mr. Zeiger from Argentina, Alexander Zeiger. He was with admirals, generals, George de Mohrenschildt, working and paid at one time by Nelson Rockefeller, the CIA, the Defense Department. Every single person Lee Harvey Oswald knows was the intelligence in the intelligence community. But this particular broadcast isn't about Oswald's contacts. It's about the mentality of the CIA in writing this kind of memo. F, as to the charges that the commission's report was a rush job, it emerged 3 months after the deadline originally set. This is the CIA saying, but to that degree that the commission tried to speed it up, this was due to the pressure of irresponsible speculation already appearing. They had too much speculation around that slowed them down for the job that they really had to do. Isn't that cute? Well, the time is running out, so I can't do more on this. I'll try and do more next week for you, or maybe a little bit each week, on how the CIA handled the authors. We didn't have time to go into both the books and the CIA documents, so I'll continue with that and get back to some of that because it's very basic to the way those people think and the way they cover up. Not only how they murder, but how they cover up. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell at KAZU FM in Pacific Grove. You take care of yourself, and I'll be back next week.